to see everybody here, faces I know and some that I don't. Thank you for coming. I'm Deb Schuessler. I'm in the Department of Education and Counseling, and this is our second annual Education and Counseling Week. And we're thrilled to have you here tonight for this event. This is our main colloquium event with Mark Greenberg, who's from Penn State. It's co-sponsored by the folks in Cognitive Science and the Department of Psychology. There's a few of those folks here. Thank you very much. Yes. It's hard to give an introduction for Mark Greenberg, but I'll try. If you Google him and look on his website or any of the websites, he's just done a lot of amazing work. So let me just touch on some highlights for you. He's the Bennett Endowed Chair in Prevention Research and Professor of Human Development and Psychology in the College of Health and Human Development at Penn State University. He also is the Director of the Prevention Research Center for the Promotion of Human Development. The Prevention Research Center aims to promote the well-being of children and youth and to reduce the prevalence of high-risk behaviors and poor outcomes for children, families, and communities. Specifically, Dr. Greenberg's research is focused on evaluating school-based early intervention programs and empirically testing curriculum interventions in areas such as social-emotional learning, violence prevention, school and community violence prevention, Head Start, self-regulation, teacher and student well-being, and mindfulness. That's just the tip of the iceberg, though. He's obtained grant funding from the National Institute of Health, U.S. Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse. I actually first came into contact with Dr. Greenberg, or we can call him Mark, he has said, when I heard him present at a conference of the Mind Life Institute, which is an organization that consists of psychologists, educators, philosophers, neuroscientists, yes, neuroscientists, and contemplatives who all gather, compare notes, collaborate on issues that have to do with this broad idea of happiness. So this was the brainchild of the Dalai Lama, and he participates in these dialogues. I actually learned a little bit more about it at our dinner earlier tonight. And I have to say I was really intrigued by this interdisciplinary convening of minds, answering questions about how we can help alleviate suffering and how we can improve well-being for children, adolescents, and adults. Obviously, Dr. Greenberg's work resonates with the mission of this organization, and clearly Dr. Greenberg's work resonates with our theme for the week, which is empowering youth. So he tonight is going to focus on this idea of mindfulness and how mindfulness practices can nurture the development of attention and reflective skills, caring, and compassion. His presentation will provide examples from newly developed mindfulness programs with families, of teens, with teachers, and students. I'm really excited that he's here with us. I'm excited you're all here to join us this evening. Please help me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Mark Greenberg.
So I'm honored to be here, and I hope I empower you to think a little bit differently than you thought when you came in, because that's what a good lecture should be. And so I'm going to give you sort of a cook's tour of thinking I've been doing recently on ideas around the general concept of mindfulness. And to do that, first I'm going to have to define mindfulness for you, and that's a sticky wicket in which people write their whole careers as scholars about what this is, both in Buddhism and Catholicism and lots of traditions. But I'm going to use a sort of a traditional secular definition we've been using in the United States about mindfulness, and I'll elaborate this as I go along, and I hope you'll stay with me for it. There's a well-known mindfulness practitioner and researcher, Jon Kabat-Zinn. Some of you may know his work. He says mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, without judgment. So it means you're paying attention, right? Hopefully you're sort of paying attention to me right now. at least to some extent. Some of your cognition is focused, but when you're being mindful, you're paying attention in the moment. You're just in the moment. You're not thinking about something before or after, and you're letting your thoughts come and go. You're letting your emotions flow through you, just like your thoughts, and you notice them, but you don't get what we could call attached to them. You just watch the process of the mind. Okay? And that's really what one definition of mindfulness is just, in a sense, paying attention and watching the mind in the present moment. Okay? It's really a hard thing to do. If it was easy, we wouldn't do training workshops to have people learn this. But that's a very, very restricted definition of what mindfulness is. I want to talk about a much more elaborated definition, and John's written about that recently. He said an awareness of one's conduct and the quality of one's relationships inwardly and outwardly in terms of their potential to cause harm are intrinsic elements of the cultivation of mindfulness. Now that sounds very different than just paying attention in the present moment, doesn't it? Okay, so how is that connected? How does sitting on a pillow, if you will, meditating, watching your breath and paying attention in the present moment relate to the potential to not cause harm and elevating and cultivating caring? Okay, how are those connected? Right. So that's the fundamental dilemma that I am trying to deal with in my work, and that is, in some ways, mindfulness in everyday life is the ultimate challenge. How do we practice being mindful, not when you're sitting on a pillow or when you're praying or you're chanting? How do you become mindful in your everyday interactions with other people? Okay? How does this transfer? Does it transfer at all? It's a good question. And that's part of the science of this. I've been involved in a group for quite a while that's worked on sort of what we even think mindfulness should lead to outcomes of. And we think it should lead to people being calm, kind, and kindness or compassion implies this idea of the concept of the interdependence of all things, that things are interdependent, that we are all interdependent. And therefore, fundamental to that independence is that you and I are not different, and our compassion is from that state of mind. And also the clarity of cognition, of the ability to be reflective, to be aware, and to dissenter from your own state of mind and see a larger picture. Okay? So these are all aspects of qualities we want to promote. And I went back and I went to the Villanova website. I should have given you a test on this. But I saw on the website, Villanova's Augustinian Catholic intellectual tradition is the cornerstone of an academic community where students learn to think critically. Is this on NPR every morning? Is it really? Just kidding. Act compassionately and succeed while serving others. Okay? Well, those are very mindful, I would say, attributes. To be able to think critically, to have a sharp mind. In fact, in the Buddhist traditions, Buddhist monks don't learn to meditate for years and years. All they learn to do is to repeat sutras over and over again. Incredible amount of repetition to practice sharpening the mind. Right? So we think about Buddhist monks as being people that sit in pillows and meditate. It's not at all how monks are trained the first 5 to 7 years of their training in Tibetan and Buddhist traditions. They don't do any of that. They recite, they practice repetition to sharpen the mind, sharpen the memory. So thinking critically, acting compassionately, and succeeding while serving others. I love that. And I'm going to come back to it later. So this work I'm going to talk about, I think, is very exciting, the idea of nurturing mindfulness in schools and in families. There's lots of new ideas that are coming to fruition. This is a field that's developing very quickly. So 7, 8 years ago, there was almost no academic research, no data on any of this, and now it's coming at a very fast pace. But there's still very little high-quality research. Most of the research is just okay at best. It's not very, very well done, but it's improving quickly. So the field's changing rapidly. This is a field that is exciting to be in because every month a new paper comes out that changes the way people are thinking about what's happening. So mindfulness is everywhere, right? You've got treadmill meditation. Anybody do treadmill meditation? You got meditation in the woods. You've got children meditating. You got dogs meditating. You got cats doing yoga. This is the geek meditation. In your mind's browser, clear your cache, delete your history, and navigate to a blank web page. Right? So you can't open a New Yorker and page through it without finding at least one mindfulness cartoon these days. So it's permeated culture, right? And that's sort of an interesting aspect itself. So mindfulness is an inherent mental capacity. It's not something you just have to develop. We all have the inherent capacity to be mindful, but like any mental capacity, if it's practiced, it's likely to get stronger. Okay? And that means that we have that inherent mental capacity to become more fully aware of our mental states and to be able to watch and not react to our mental states. Some meditation practices focus on just that bare attention of watching your mental states or staying in touch with your breathing, only watching the breath, right? And other meditative states or meditation practices have a conceptual, explicit discussion. In fact, one of the ways that monks are trained is through argument. One of the ways that rabbis are trained is through argument. True in the Catholic Church also. The argument is used. Discussion, discursive discussion, argument is one of the ways that people are trained. So there's lots of practices. Some focus on bare attention. Some might focus on caring in the heart. Others use conceptual thought and values. There's lots of different ways. In fact, in psychology, we talk about what we call person-environment fit or temperament-person fit. And in fact, if you go back and look at the writings attributed to the Buddha, which is about over 2,000 years ago, he talks about the same thing. He talks about temperament by meditation practice fit, that certain kinds of temperaments need certain kinds of practices to alleviate their suffering, if you will, and other people have different temperaments, would use different practices. Okay? There's a long, long history of all of this. But in any of these ideas about mindfulness, the idea is to step out of your habitual thought, step out of your habitual patterns of thinking and bring awareness and compassion to your mental state. Okay? And this is in fact what prayer is, right? Prayer is in fact one of the techniques for mindfulness, as I'll get to. And a central goal of that is to cultivate a sense of caring and compassion. Right? Now, that sounds very different than the first statement I showed you. That first statement I showed you about paying attention in the present moment. Oops. Right? Paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally, doesn't sound like it has anything to do with ethics, right? Ethics or values. But as we get deeper into mindfulness, we see that it's much more than that, that in fact it has a very strong sense of ethics and values. And that engaging in a mindful awareness means not only being aware in the present. In fact, the word mindfulness, if you trace the word in Sanskrit, has to do with remembrance or remembering, not just with being present in the moment. But it also means to reflect on a set of ethics, including not doing harm to others or engaging in wholesome actions. Okay? So how does that work together? How does paying attention in the present moment and not engaging in unwholesome actions work together, right? Well, this involves recollecting and reflecting on one's actions with discrimination, evaluation, and mature judgment. That's why a sharp mind is as necessary as just bare awareness, right? So rather than being reactive, you're being reflective. So mindfulness, in some ways, is seeing things as they really are with a very clear sense of comprehension, with a clear sense of intentionality in your thinking. And this allows what in Buddhist language is called right view, right effort, right speech, right concentration, right action, and right livelihood. It's what's called the Eightfold Path. Right? So in Buddhism, one talks about being mindful as living in the path of rightness, if you will, and that you're mindful about everything you do, about your speech, the intentions behind your speech, your understanding of others, the kind of livelihood you have, how you use your attention, etc. And in fact, it looks just like Villanova University's mission statement, which I also went and found, right? Which says, encourage students, faculty, and staff to engage in service experiences and research locally and globally so they learn from others, provide public service to the community, and help create a sustainable world. Commit to the common good and apply the knowledge and skills of our students and faculty to better the human condition. Encourage students and faculty to pursue virtue by integrating love and knowledge, right? Critical thinking and compassion, right? And by committing themselves to research and education for justice with a special concern for the poor and compassion for the suffering. Respect a worldview that recognizes all creation is sacred and that fosters responsible stewardship and values your relationship with your neighbors and the community. Okay? It's very much a statement of, in many ways, not put in the Buddhist words, but put in the Catholic words, of what people call being mindful. Okay? Right action, right speech, etc. So I'm interested in how people, even though this is an inherent mental capacity, become more mindful And there's an enormous amount of research on mindfulness now in the adult world, in the adult literature, in psychology, in neuroscience, in medicine. For example, there's a lot of research showing that these are all done in randomized trials, that if you teach people mindfulness, and you can do that by teaching something like the mindfulness-based stress response, it's a 10-week course that John Kabat-Zinn developed, you'll see that you can decrease people's depression. For people that are already being treated for depression with cognitive behavioral treatments, if you add mindfulness to the cognitive behavioral treatment at about half the rate of relapse back to depression again, well documented, replicated in a number of laboratories. There's lots of work on teaching mindfulness to reduce anxiety. And all of this began when John Kabat-Zinn started these mindfulness-based stress clinics starting at the University of Massachusetts in Worcester, which was all around chronic pain. The biggest problem that physicians often have with the patients is chronic pain, and he used mindfulness to reduce their pain. Okay? But it's been used now in lots of areas. It caught fire. So there's some very nice work showing that it reduces relapse and substance use by Bowen and Katie Witkowitz. There's work on suicide. There's work on improving marital relations through teaching mindfulness. So both symptoms and in behaviors. The sexy part of this, though, is the neuroscience, because the brain is, as Woody Allen says, our second favorite organ. You like that one, huh? So there's lots of work in this. This is where people really become interested. This is where CEOs come to workshops and stuff because they think there's something special about the brain. But there's lots of data by lots of people showing that people who, both long-term meditators compared to other people, but that has a selection bias, but as well in randomized trials, that when people are taught to meditate, and most of this is done in the context of mindfulness-based stress response, but it's been done in other ways I'll talk about. You see changes in fMRI signals mostly in the frontal area, the dorsolateral prefrontal area, and the anterior cingulate. Same thing with EEG findings. You see people become more left frontal in their activity, which is related to wellness rather than depression. There's a lot of data on the executive functions of working memory, inhibitory control, and attention. Amishi Jha, who used to be at Penn, is an example of someone that's done work in that area. And there's data on psychophysiology. So we see changes have been replicated in the effects on cortisol, that is the stress reactivity system of the body, on telomere activity. I don't know if you know what telomeres are, but they are the ends of our DNA. And as we get old, they start to unravel, the telomerase. And there's a new study by Eppel, who got the Nobel Prize in this area, showing that long-term meditation reduces the rate of aging of the telomerase in the DNA. So even going down to that level. And there's data on changing immune function, blood pressure, all these kinds of what you'd call medical predictors of illness. In fact, this is a chart from about 6 months ago of the number of peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals on mindfulness. And you can see that in 2003 there were less than 100 total, and now there are somewhere around 800 a year. And now it's even larger. In fact, it's very hard to keep up even with this very small field because it's growing so quickly. Right? And you see it across so many different kinds of science, from basic neuroscience journals or the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences all the way to a journal like Asthma. People are trying these kinds of techniques throughout. And they're not always working, of course, but there's a lot to be said here. So the idea here is to think in ways that are a little different, right? And so that's what we've been trying to do. And we have a group at Penn State that I work with, great colleagues that are interested in these different areas. People interested in mindfulness and teaching. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the teaching research tonight, mindfulness and parenting, and mindfulness in kids. And with us tonight, I'll just embarrass her for a minute, is Trish Broderick. And she is your local expert on mindfulness in kids and has done amazing work in this area. With the Breathe curriculum and other things. And if you want local expertise, she is it. I won't tell you about all these people, but they're great to work with. And we've been interested in this transfer issue. So how does paying attention in the present moment, sitting on a cushion, meditating, or chanting Gregorian chants, we could go into other possible ways you might, yoga is another way to do this, lots of ways. How does this translate into being more interpersonally mindful? As being more mindful in the moment in your relationships, right? And can we, if it's true that it does that, can we detect it? So we've been thinking about this for quite a while, written a couple papers on the idea of the indicators of mindfulness that are not inside. Remember I showed you things like symptoms, right? So we can look at symptoms like pain, and we can look at people's behavior. We can even look at their self-reports. There are self-report measures of mindfulness. We can look at brain activity and psychophysiology. But who cares? My answer is, who cares if in fact these techniques don't make us better in the way we relate to each other? Okay? But the problem is, there's almost no research on how it helps us relate to each other. That's the missing link here. So we've been thinking about this, and we think there are a number of attributes of people that are mindful, we believe, that we would see if it's actually working in interpersonal context, right? People would be listening more with full attention to others, being in the present moment in their listening. They'd be more present-centered in their emotions, as they'd be knowing how they're feeling as they're feeling it. And if they're teachers with their students, they'd be more interpersonally aware in the moment. They'd be more open and non-judgmental and receptive to their child's thoughts and feelings. I put low because as a parent who's had 2 teenagers, you can't be non-judgmental. Right? If you do, you're going to be in real trouble. You got to have boundaries as a parent. But low in judgmentalness, right? So you're not like jumping on the kids right away before they even tell you what they're thinking, because you want to control their behavior, which is a big issue for parents of teenagers especially. And to be self-regulated, what we call being low in reactivity and low in automaticity, right? So you're not highly reactive. You don't fly off the handle as soon as something happens. You're able to calm yourself down, see your emotions, take a deep breath, etc. And you're low in automaticity, that you're actually in the moment and you're thinking about what you should do right now, not just using your habitual patterns, which is usually what we rely on, especially in our interpersonal interactions. And if you're a teacher, that also means being aware and responsive to children's individual needs, or what we call a teachable moment in education. And often teachers aren't aware of the teachable moment. They're only aware of it after they didn't respond to it. Right? And lastly, because all these things are impossible to do, anybody very good at all these things? Not one hand goes up. You've got to have compassion for the whole process, for yourself, for how difficult it is, to have a soft edge to this and not be critical of the fact that, in fact, you're not terribly good at all these things, and have compassion for your children, for them not being perfect, and compassion for your parents, for them not being perfect either, rather than blaming them for what you became. So there's a softness around this also. So we think these are the inner indicators of mindfulness we would see in interpersonal context if it's working well. But we don't think that the transfer is automatic. Because I don't really believe that sitting on a pillow in a retreat for 3 days or 3 weeks or 3 months, or I know people have done 3 years, will necessarily make you any more interpersonally aware or mindful in your relationships. In fact, I know lots of people that go to meditation retreats all the time. They're unbelievably neurotic, right? And I know people that have never meditated in their lives that meet all those criteria of being very interpersonally mindful. Okay? And that's partly because it's an inherent quality, but also it's related to the quality of our past relationships. So we're interested in this. We're interested in how can we cultivate these ideas. If we want to cultivate these abilities in teachers, for example, or in parents, or in teens, how do we go about doing it? Okay? So that's what we've been interested in and what we've been doing our research trials on. And so I'll tell you a little bit about 3 of them. One is teaching. We're working with teachers. It's called CARE, Cultivating Awareness and Resilience in Education. And I don't need to tell people here that teaching is a very stressful profession. This CARE project actually emerged out of our meetings with the Dalai Lama, in which after about 3 days of meeting with him, he turned to myself and a neuroscientist and a monk, a Buddhist monk named Alan Wallace, and he said, if we know so much in the East about the mind and mindfulness, and we know so much in the West about emotion regulation, why is it there aren't any curriculums for normal adults to make them more compassionate? Sort of an interesting question, isn't it? Now, you could say that prayer is one way of doing that. That's sort of a curriculum for compassion, I think. But it made us think about this and what we would do, and we identified 3 groups of people in our culture: teachers, nurses, and police. We thought are incredibly important to the human social capital of our communities, and that have highly stressful jobs and that are mostly not paid much attention to. And so we started with teachers. That's where we've been doing our work. And the idea is to try to integrate teaching teachers better emotion skills, that is becoming more aware of their own emotions and the emotions of their students, and teaching them mindfulness techniques at the same time. And so this occurs, we want to teach them how to relate to students better, how to manage their classrooms, how to model pro-social behavior. And we have a number of trials that are going on that are doing that, and I'll talk a little bit about them. We want to increase their mindfulness, their positive affect, their efficacy, and we want to decrease their burnout and their negative affect. Right? So teachers are a very stressed profession. If you believe the data, at least in urban areas like Chicago and Philadelphia, somewhere around 50% of teachers cycle out of the job in the first 5 years. So that's an unbelievable loss of human social capital. Think about how much, just think about economically, how much money goes into preparing teachers and moving them into the classroom. And if half of them are leaving the profession in 5 years, it's an incredible social deficit for all of us, let alone the trauma that many of them experience that leads them to leave. So we think they're an example of an important population. And Tish Jennings, who is the leader of this work, and myself wrote a paper about this, where basically we're interested in students' social, emotional, and academic outcomes. We think to have good outcomes, we want to have healthy classrooms. Healthy classrooms rely on healthy student-teacher relationships, good classroom management, and good implementation of social emotional learning. But that requires a teacher that's social emotionally competent. And it's funny, we spend all the time on this part of it, and we spend no time on this. Almost none at all. So that's what we're interested in. We're interested in the teachers themselves. In fact, when teachers come to our workshops, they're excited because finally they say it's something for me and not curriculum for the kids. So the way we do care is we do it in 5 days, starting with a 2-day retreat, and then 1 day successively over a couple months. And then in between the days, we do phone coaching, usually about once every week or two, calling them up and asking them if they've been using the ideas, how's it going, how can we be helpful, and then we develop a sustainability plan with them. So this is a trial, and in this kind of trial, we randomize teachers. In this case, we use teachers in Harrisburg School District, and the surrounding areas. So about half very, very stressed urban teachers and about half suburban teachers. And randomized, half of them got the intervention, half of them didn't, and we look at their behavior before and afterwards, of course. And this is just some initial data from our pilot study. And so here's the post-test means adjusted for pre-test for those of you that are into statistics. And then you see the significance levels. Asterisks are good. 1 means 0.05, 2 means 0.01. And then what's probably more important, given it's a small sample size, is the effect size of the outcomes. Okay? So what we see is that teachers report in the intervention compared to the control group improvements in their efficacy as teachers, a reduction in their what they call time urgency, or their sense of that they're always hurrying, a really significant reduction in their daily physical symptoms. So we have symptom checklists of physical symptoms. And changes in their emotion regulation and their ability to reappraise, their self-reports of how they reappraise difficult situations. And a non-significant effect, but almost in the opposite direction, in suppressing their emotions. And a significant effect in their burnout. Teacher-reported burnout from the Maslach, it's a well-known scale. And non-significant, but in the right direction, effects on positive affect, negative affect, and depression. So it's a promissory note. This is new work. And it shows that, at least to some extent, that first of all, that it's feasible to do this work. The teachers enjoy it. The focus group outcomes are quite positive. But also that it can have effects on, at least in the short term, on their outcomes. I was at a meeting a couple years ago in which I was told that this is a state of Wisconsin, that in the state of Wisconsin, between 25 and 35% of teachers are on depression medication any day during the year. Okay? So these effects may not only affect student outcomes and the quality of teaching, but they may affect school board budgets in the long run, because healthcare costs are the fastest driving costs that's reducing the money that's left for us to do the rest of education. So here's a teacher in a focus group after they went to care. She says, I'm being more aware of the kids, more opportunities to talk with them, just more aware in general of myself and what I'm feeling, what I'm eating, what I'm doing, where I'm going. My awareness has been heightened, and if I can just keep reminding myself of that, just to be aware of other people, aware of my own stuff, that's a huge thing for me. So one of the things we teach teachers in care is we teach them to set intentions. A very simple thing in mindfulness is just to set an intention. It's a little different than a goal. An intention is something softer than a goal. A goal is something you have to reach. An intention is an aim or something you would like to have happen. So one thing we teach them is that before they get to school in the morning, they can do it in the shower, and they can do it in the car, what I call windshield work, is just to set an intention for the day, just to say to themselves, this is what I'd like my day to be like today. Or here's something today I'd really like to see happen, I'd like to work on. Okay? Something very simple. Just takes 15 seconds or 30 seconds. But this is an example of an idea that carried into everyday life. We teach teachers how they can do walking meditation. So even when they're teaching their class, they can become aware of their bodies, right? How to have a presence in the classroom, how to be able to listen more deeply to kids. There's lots of techniques. Some of them involve sitting meditation. Some of them involve what's called metta meditations or loving kindness meditations. We call them caring meditations, in which we do a meditation in which they are reflecting on their love for their family or someone close to them, and then for their wishing for peace and happiness and wellness for their friends, and then it goes out to maybe their school or their community and for themselves. Very simple kind of what's called a metta or loving kindness meditation. There's another teacher, she says, I'm more calm. Even when I'm at home drinking coffee, my mind's not racing 1,000 different places. I'm just liking my coffee. That's sort of present moment awareness. I've learned how to just take things for what they are and not keep everything on my shoulders all the time. And because I'm not doing that, that allows me to treat my kids better and address their needs better and try to teach them to be that way through my example. She's just more calm and present. And I could go on, but I won't, because I'm going to switch to parents. Parenting, as many people know, is probably the greatest challenge in life. And if you didn't think it was before you had teenagers, you'll surely think it once they become teenagers. Parenting is quite complicated to do well. And so we've been very interested in how we can take already existing parenting curriculums. There's a number of very good ones, evidence-based curriculums for parents of 6th graders, 7th graders, early teen years, and help parents to become more caring and mindful in the way they relate to teenagers. Teenage years are especially stressful for both parents and kids, and we want to interrupt the automatic negative relationship patterns that often develop between teens and their parents. We want to pay attention to parents and their own well-being. We want them to become more compassionate with their kids, and especially to use these skills when things get tough. When we started this, there were no tests of any curriculums that would teach mindfulness to parents. Very interesting. And so we, again, have these same 5 elements I showed you before. We want to teach parents how to listen with full attention, to be more aware of their own emotions. What triggers them? What is it that their kids do that makes them really angry or makes them really sad or confuses them? To understand those triggers ahead of time. To become less judgmental with their kids, to actually listen to what they have to say before replying, to be more self-regulated and to be more compassionate. And so we want to change this cycle that you often see. It's been well written about by many people, that you have youth responsive negativity and parent negativity, and this cycles into increasingly hostile parenting by parents and kids disengaging, giving up, saying, my parents are useless, why even talk to them? And I'm going to show you a video about that right now. So in the curriculum we use, we took an already evidence-based program called Strengthening Families Iowa. It's developed by an extension agent in Iowa. It's a 7-night program for parents for 6th and 7th graders. I've been involved, and other people have been involved in research already showing that when you randomize families to come or not come to this parenting model for 7 nights, it dramatically decreases significantly drug and alcohol use all the way through the end of high school. Okay? And it improves the quality of relationships in the family, both by parents' report and by kids' reports. So we took that model program, and we worked with a developer to build in these ideas of compassion and non-judgmentalness, etc. And I'm just going to show you a tape or two that is an example of the kind of thing you'd show to parents in this kind of session. if I get it to work.
We really want our kids to come to us with their problems and questions. We want them to talk to us so we know what's going on and so we can help them. But sometimes we get so worried about what they're telling us that we end up jumping all over them. Let's watch some parents who forget to listen.
Wow, that was a close call. Jason almost got caught shoplifting.
Shoplifting? What do you mean, shoplifting? Are you boys getting into trouble?
I knew that Jason was up to no good. That's it. You're not hanging around with him anymore.
Are you in trouble? What did you take?
It's no use talking to you guys. You won't even listen to what happened.
So as a teenager, I was on the teen side of that, and as a parent, I've been on the parent side of that, right? Probably many of you have, right? It's a very tough situation to not be reactive in, right? Right? I'll show you another example that's used in the curriculum just to give you a feel for it.
Sometimes parents don't criticize when their kids come to them with a problem, but they load them down with advice instead of listening.
Boy, you sure have been quiet since we finished dinner. Something bothering you?
Oh, it's nothing, really.
Amanda, who can tell me? What's going on?
Well, it's just this thing with Bobby. I really like him, but he's getting kind of pushy.
Pushy? What do you mean by pushy?
Well, he's not really doing anything yet, but
Amanda, are you telling me that you're getting interested in sex already at your age? Don't you know how dangerous it is?
yes, but Mom.
Amanda, this is just... You are way too young to be thinking about things like this. Do you know what you can catch? Do you know that you can get pregnant? What? When I was your age, I wasn't even allowed to hang around with boys unless it was a school function and we were chaperoned. You're just going to have to tell Bobby that you can't see him if he's pushing you to have sex.
So of course, in the parenting program, which is 7 nights long, there's lots of videos like this, and we talk about how could a parent respond differently. We have parents do role plays of how differently they could respond. We stop the tape different places and say, okay, now if you wanted to be less judgmental, what could you say then? When he comes in and says Bobby was caught shoplifting, rather than saying, what, shoplifting? How else could you respond, right? So that's the idea, is to teach parents to slow down, to listen more. They may end up having the same consequence, right? That's not the issue. The issue is not the consequence. It's the relationship process of communication and awareness with the teen. So we did a reasonably small randomized trial. We had 65 families that we recruited, and we assigned them to either this is what's called a comparative effectiveness study. We had developed this new version that was a mindfulness version of parenting, and then we compared it to the Strengthening Families that was already existing, the already evidence-based program, and then we compared it also to a control group, a delayed intervention. It's a small study, just a post-test only. We did immediate pre- and post-test. What we found changes in the mindful parenting program, in the mindfulness version, in anger management, in mother's positive affect by her report, and her negative affect, and also by the youth's report. And so what we found was that the parents who were in the mindfulness program also reported reporting they were more mindful as parents. The controls declining a little bit, and the ones in the other evidence-based program staying about the same. And when we look at maternal well-being, this compares the mindfulness version to the control. The mindfulness version, this is the effect size, 0.4. And this compares the mindfulness version to the already evidence-based version, showing, again, some improvements. So that while the evidence-based version, compared to the control, also showed effects, the version that added the mindfulness improved its outcomes. Okay? Again, promising, that's all. We have a very large trial going on now in about 6 counties in Pennsylvania, which involves 600 families, 200 randomized to the mindful version, 200 randomized to the evidence-based strengthening family version, and 200 that are in comparison groups. It's what one father said afterwards in a focus group. I find that the more I can remove the anger I'm feeling from the situation, the more productive the solution becomes, and I can stop and think and feel and express not only how I'm feeling, but it gives my daughter a chance to express how she's feeling, and it gives me time. That's the important thing. It gives me some time to understand how she's feeling and remember how old she is, and that no matter what it is, it's not the end of the world. Right? He's decentering in a way. He's saying his thoughts are just thoughts and not reality, because his thoughts are saying, I've got to do something right now, right? This is the end of the world. And he's stepping back and saying, oh, so this is not the end of the world. She's just upset. I'm upset. I need to calm down. She needs to calm down. Then we can talk about it, right? Okay. So also we've been doing work with kids, and this is mostly in inner city Baltimore. I want to recognize my colleagues. I work with a really unbelievable set of young men in Baltimore who are called the Traveling Yogis. They started their own foundation called the Holistic Life Foundation. This is Ali and Atman Smith brothers and Andreas Gonzalez. They all went to school at University of Maryland. They graduated. They didn't want to get into the rat race. They went back to their old neighborhood. They started hanging around schools in their neighborhood, and they started helping the principal because they didn't. All their friends went into corporate jobs. One of them has an MBA. They didn't want to do it. And then Andy and Atman remembered their parents were African American hippies in the 60s, and they taught them yoga when they were kids. And they decided that they were going to start to do yoga again. And so they just started doing yoga themselves with Andy. And then they told a principal that they were doing yoga, and the principal said, well, you know, you can do it at my school with the kids. And then they started an after-school program in North Baltimore. And then I met them, and they were very open to the idea of doing randomized trials to see what yoga can do. Does yoga have effect? What kind of effect does yoga have as a way of teaching mindfulness for kids? And that's pretty difficult territory they got into with me, because it's just as well I could show that there are no effects at all, which would not be good. We're interested in having scientific scrutiny. And so we've been working together for about, about 5 years now, doing programs, and the woman next to them, Tamara Mendelsohn at Johns Hopkins, is my colleague in doing this work. And they have a particular way in which they're doing yoga. Yoga is a very complex word because it implies many, many different kinds of activities. There is just the kind of typical physical yoga that many people go to, but the kind of yoga we're talking about, while it has physical parts, that is poses, it also has a very strong mindfulness component. And so why did I get interested in yoga? I wanted to teach kids how to become calm and kind and to be able to watch themselves and reflect on themselves. But if you take a group of like 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds, it doesn't matter if they're urban or rural, it doesn't matter if they're high risk or not, and you tell them to close their eyes and watch their breath, you're an idiot. I mean, it isn't going to happen, right? It's just another sort of insidious adult form of punishment, right? Like Sunday school, right? Okay? So I got really interested. I lived in Seattle for 20 years. I got very interested in Tai Chi and martial arts as a way of teaching kids self-control, and I actually started to do a little research on that. But when I met the yogis, I realized that you could use the yoga and the kids could really get into the physical aspects of this. And then, how many people have done yoga in this room? Okay, right? So you do the yoga for a little while, and then you lay down in what we call the corpse position, or what yoga teachers call shavasana, and it feels so relaxing, right? It feels so calming. You just want to close your eyes and feel your back on the floor and your shoulders on the floor and relax. And it's exactly the same, doesn't matter how high risk or difficult a kid is. If you can get them to go through the poses and learn them, when they lay down, they love it and they're quiet. And I saw kids that were very, very, very high risk by any model of how you assess this. In fact, boys and girls together, 11 and 12-year-olds, and they would get into the poses and really get into it, and then they'd lay down, and for 5 minutes they'd be completely silent, right? And I thought, wow, this is amazing. You could actually teach mindfulness in that context. And so the yogis and I worked through the process of teaching them teaching them mindfulness ideas, sometimes watching their breath, sometimes doing loving kindness meditation, sometimes imagining a candle in their heart, just focusing on where that is and feeling the warmth of it. Different techniques that allow them to focus their attention and also open up their ethics of compassion. So, So we've been doing trials, just like we've done with the teachers and the parents. And I Googled yoga for kids last year, and I found 21 million hits. There are yoga groups out there everywhere, and they are claiming that yoga does everything. You know, it does every single thing you can imagine, from increasing brain organization to changing blood pressure to et cetera. And there is actually some good adult studies on yoga and its effects. But it turns out there's never been a randomized trial for yoga with normal kids. I was amazed. I went to the literature. I thought, I'm going to find all kinds of things, right? Yoga is done all over the world. Lots of people go to it. 15% of women in America go to yoga regularly, right? Not many men go regularly, but some do. And there's lots of research on adults. And it turns out there was not even one study ever done that's a randomized trial with regular kids. There have been studies of asthmatic kids in asthmatic clinics, and there's been studies of ADHD kids in psychiatric clinics, but nothing of just kids. What does it do? So we did a study in Baltimore City, and we asked the question, can yoga and mindfulness support the improvement in coping and attention in children? It was a randomized trial, and we took 4 schools in inner city Baltimore, and we randomized them. 2 of the schools, if parents consented, the kids got the yoga. And we studied originally about 40 kids in the intervention and 40 kids in the control group. Okay? Kids came to yoga during their resource period, when they could be doing art or music or phys ed, 4 times a week for 16 weeks. It turns out we've changed that because they don't like 4 times a week, because it means they can't go to any of their other resource rooms. So now we do it 2 times a week, but for about 25 weeks. And the sessions last about 45 minutes, but don't really, because it takes like 10 minutes to 15 minutes on each end, getting them into the room and settled down and back out of the room again. So they do a series of yogic exercises that end with a period of mindfulness training when they're in the corpse position. We progress from simple to more complex postures over the period of the curriculum. And the mindfulness training is a guided experience. We guide them in different ways, different days in the curriculum, on their mats when they're relaxed. And they're instructed to withdraw their attention from distractions around them to a focal point, like their breath or their heartbeat. And they're guided to keep their minds focused and centered, strengthening their capacity to not be distracted. Okay? So we've been looking at the effects of this, and the first study we didn't do a very good job. You know, when you start doing new studies in new areas, you usually make so many mistakes. It's just amazing that you get any data out that's useful. But we didn't have money to pay teachers, and half the teachers wouldn't complete the post-test measures, so we don't have teacher reports. We used some neuroscience measures that have to do with executive function, but it turns out the tasks were too difficult for the kids. Even though we had consultation from Adele Diamond and Amishi Jha and all kinds of people, they were wrong about what would work as a pre- and post-test measure. But we have changes we have data from the kids on their own behavior and their self-regulation. And this is where we really found the changes. We found that, that children that were in the intervention compared to the randomized controls showed lower rates of 3 things. Rumination, which is an example of a question is, when I have problems with other kids, I can't stop thinking about them, can't stop thinking about the problem. Emotional arousal, when I have problems with other kids, right away I feel angry, sad, scared, or worried. These are example questions. And intrusive thoughts. When I have problems with other kids, I can't stop thinking about them when I try to sleep or I have bad dreams about them. And all of these 3 dimensions occurred at really high rates in the kids at pretest, because these kids are living in neighborhoods in which I think almost all of them experience post-traumatic stress every day, right? Where they're scary places for them to live. They have a lot of anxiety, and they're very aware of their environments and what could happen to them. And they're always watching out to make sure they're safe. So they have a lot of ruminative thoughts. And these are really the best predictors in the early teenage years of depression and anxiety disorders. Right? So lots of work on the issue of cognitive rumination as a predictor. So we found significant effects on these things, on involuntary engagement, on rumination, intrusive thoughts, and emotional arousal. And And while not significant, again, with a relatively small sample size, also on how impulsive they report they are in their behavior and how physiologically aroused they become. Okay? So a good promissory note, I think, again, relatively small trial, sort of new work, first published paper in the scientific literature on the effects of yoga on children. Although now there are a number, there's one more that's just come out with high school children. And of course, Trish has done work, it's not yoga, but teaching mindfulness in an adolescent version of the mindfulness-based stress response, but also been showing effects. So here's an example of the involuntary engagement data, which involuntary engagement is the factor that involves rumination and intrusive thoughts. And what you see is that intervention children are going up a little bit across the year of school, and the controls are coming down. Okay? So it looks like there's something there in all this mindfulness work. And so what are the ways you can be mindful? There's lots of different ways. This is what's called the Tree of Contemplative Practices, done by a group in Massachusetts. And they talk about many, many different ways you can be mindful, right? So while meditation and yoga have been privileged in the research, there's lots of ways to be mindful. And we don't know what the effects of many of them are. So for example, how many of you have been involved in centering prayer? Okay. Everybody aware of centering prayer? Does everybody know about Father Keating and centering prayer as one of the fundamental mindfulness approaches in Catholicism? No? You might find it really interesting. Does anybody who's done centering prayer want to say something about it? Yeah.
I've done like the Jesus prayer
Uh-huh.
or other one-word prayers.
Right.
It clears your mind out.
Right, and it's a silent, meditative approach. It comes really from Thomas Merton and Father Keating. If you don't know Father Keating, he's an unbelievable contemplative. So that's an example of a stillness practice, just like sitting meditation. But there are other kinds of approaches. There are movement approaches. For example, labyrinths have been done for thousands of years, and walking meditations, martial arts and yoga, pilgrimages, right? A walking pilgrimage is a walking meditation, right? It's a contemplative practice. There's what are called creation practices like chanting, journaling, contemplative art. There are activist practices that some people talk about, like vigils and marches or bearing witness to things, which are contemplative practices. There's generative practices. This is wiggling for some reason, but things like the Jesus prayer and loving kindness meditations and mantra repetitions in the Hindu traditions. There are many different ways of thinking about this. There are ritual kinds of mindfulness, like the way the Jews celebrate Shabbos, right? Or communion could be seen as another kind of ritual practice of that kind. There are relational practices like storytelling and deep listening. So I want you to think about this as being a very broad, fundamental area in which science doesn't have to intrude on all these things necessarily, but the extent that we show that some of these things have power, they have the power to improve people, to improve their mindfulness, their caring, their compassion, their ability to relate positively to others, to their communities. This is interesting, and it brings, I think, a new sense of the dimension of how these can be used. And many of them are secular, by the way. They don't intrude on church-state issues. Some of them do. So, for example, there's a form of mindfulness now used in schools from the David Lynch Foundation that comes from transcendental meditation. And transcendental meditation is clearly it comes from a Hindu practice, just like centering prayer comes from Catholicism. But there are many secular versions, like the work that Trish does or the yoga work I've done with kids, where there are no church-state issues at all. So there are different kinds of mindfulness. There are intrapersonal forms of mindfulness, that is, it's only inside yourself, like sitting meditation, walking meditation, prayer, silent, only by yourself. And there are interpersonal activities, like learning how to listen and storytell in a contemplative way, or contemplative dialogue, or forms of martial arts, all kinds of contemplative practices. And we know a lot about these forms of practice. We know a lot about the fact that they affect brain activity and symptoms of pain and self-reports of mindfulness and neuroscience outcomes. We don't know hardly anything about these. No one has done much study of these. We don't know what effects they have. They may be very good for certain conditions or certain people, certain kinds of health outcomes and not others. And similarly, we don't know much about how these intrapersonal forms of meditation affect outcomes that are interpersonal, how we relate to each other. Right? We know a lot about symptoms and brain organization and pain, etc. We don't know much about how it relates to how people relate. And we don't know much about the opposite here, how these interpersonal activities might affect the internal function. So this is a new field. Even though I showed you there's 800 peer-reviewed publications a year coming out, they've almost all been related to symptoms, self-reports, and neuroscience. And this whole field of how any of these things relate to interpersonal outcomes, the development of empathy, the development of caring, charity, sense of genuineness, reduction in maltreatment in parents, improvement in the quality of life in marriages, right? We don't know anything yet about these, almost nothing, almost zero about the effects of contemplative practices on these outcomes. So I think it's a pretty exciting field to work in right now. And the practices probably are important, but they're not the whole thing. The Buddha was a pretty smart fellow, and he said that there are three components when you change. One is the practices that you do. It could be prayer or chanting or a ritual, meditation, all kinds of practices I've shown you. But the second thing is there's what he called a dharma or a worldview or an orientation towards the world. That's the ethics. And then lastly, there's a sangha or a community, and that community has implicit norms and values that holds together the worldview and the practices, right? So what is church? Have you ever gone to church where you haven't had a sermon or a homily, right? Where you just go and say prayers and walk out? No, because we know that it doesn't matter if it's Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or Muslim or Sufi, it doesn't matter. You're always going to find these three things, these three elements together. Okay? And we really don't know how much of the change process is due to just one of these. So for example, we secularized some of these practices like meditation, and we do them just themselves. But I don't think they can be separated from a worldview of ethics, right? When you go to a meditation retreat or you go to church, you always have an opening, you always have practices, you always have some kind of worldview, sermon, or dharma talk of some kind. Every tradition has them. And you have some kind of ritual closing, right? It's fundamental to the way that we've learned as a culture. We feel closer to each other, and we learn from each other. And we do our parenting classes the same way. Instead of starting our parenting classes for mindfulness by saying, "Hi, I'm Mark, and I'm real glad you came tonight, and it's really nice that you're here, and I've got a lot to tell you, so let's get started," we would start by saying, it's the fact that you've come tonight to come to my parenting class shows that you have an intention inside of you to be a certain kind of parent. And I really want to honor that sense of your intention of being a certain kind of parent. And since we all got here just now and we've all probably been stressed by the day, let's start by taking just a few deep breaths. Maybe sit with your feet forward and your back off the chair. And let's just take a few deep breaths and think about how lucky we are to be able to come tonight together and learn from each other. Okay? Sort of sounds like church, doesn't it? Right? And then similarly, when we end, we don't end by saying, "Oh, this was a great night," and go home and have a good night. We end by having them reflect again on what they learned tonight and how they carry it back into the world, just like you would do in a religious service. Because religions understand a lot about change, right? They understand that these three components together have a very powerful influence that's probably stronger than any one of them alone, that they interact together. So when we think about how we're trying to do our work, even though it's secular, we think the same way. We think about how do we add practices, a dharma or a worldview, in this case about caring and compassion, secularly, and a sense of community together. So there are lots of skills that we can teach people, and we think that there's a theory here that skilled practice of some kind of mindfulness practice, yoga, meditation, leads to changing habits of thoughts and minds. Now I'm talking as a psychologist, and they change to self-awareness and skill use across contexts. But this may be a very simple psychological view. I think it's much more than that. I think it's also that it's not just skilled practice that leads people to change, that it's their insights. In fact, oftentimes people can have insight that makes change much faster than a lot of skilled practice, okay? Especially when it's supported by a community, by a sangha. So when we're thinking about our work, we're thinking about how those work together. So So here's an example of that. This is a teacher. She said, I like attitudinal adjustment. I think it's a really good way to describe the teacher mindfulness she went through, because it's really, it's your whole, the way you look at a lot of things. It's almost like you give people a cushion, and I'm giving my kids a cushion, and I give myself a cushion, and allowed myself to realize why I react certain ways to certain things, and that helps me to maybe not just put it on other people anymore. I think about myself differently. I think about my students differently. I think attitude adjustment is a good way to put it. Not that you had a bad one before, but that you look at everything differently. Okay? So that's a worldview. She's taking a different view. She interprets the world differently than she did before. So there's lots to be done in this field. We have to think about when we examine any of these practices, could be chanting or prayer or yoga or meditation or contemplative storytelling. What are the goals of the intervention? What's the logic model? What can we measure? And how does it relate to age and context? And we assume that these are the kinds of skills that we want to change in these interventions, self-regulatory skills like attention and emotional regulation, cognitive skills, and social-emotional competencies that are out in the real world like empathy and communication skills. But it may be that some interventions affect some of these and other interventions affect others of them. So we need clear description of these interventions. We need rich descriptions. Where does the intervention come from? How are we changing it across time? How do we make it age appropriate for the right age group? Who is the instructor and what's their training? What's the frequency at which we'd have to do it for it to have an effect? For example, if we do yoga 4 times a week in a school, that's a real lot of mass practice. But what if we only did it once a week? We did it for 4 times as long. Would it have the same effect? No idea. And what do we do outside of the sessions? What kind of outside of sessions assignments do people have, and does it make a difference to what they do? We send the kids home with all kinds of practices they're supposed to do between sessions. In the parenting program, we have parents who are supposed to practice and come back with homework each week. In the teacher interventions, we call them, and now we're starting to text them regularly to give them little reminders. But we don't know what effect they have. So what can mindfulness practices do? Why should we want to nurture them? Well, we don't really know. I'm giving you a promissory note. I give you a Cook's tour of 3 interventions, one for parents, one for teachers, and one for kids. But these may have very different outcomes depending upon the kind of practice we use. For example, a breathing practice, a compassion-focused practice, an attentional training practice. And it may depend on the population. So if we're working in Villanova, it maybe will have different effects than if we're working in inner city Philadelphia. And lastly, we need a clear theory of change in order to contextualize these practices into the context that we use them, because I don't think they're going to all have the same effects in everywhere. So for example, yoga seems to have more effects in India, where yoga is central to the culture, than it probably does here. So I just want to thank my partners. I have a lot of people who work with me on this, people at the Garrison Institute, the Holistic Life Foundation, my yogis in Baltimore, people at Johns Hopkins, lots of school districts we work in, and the center I work at. And the funders that work on this, the Garrison Institute, which is a center for contemplative practice in New York State, the Mind and Life Institute, and a series of foundations and federal agencies that have funded the work. So I want to end with a historian, Howard Zinn. It turns out actually it's the father-in-law of John Kabat-Zinn. Howard Zinn, does anybody know Howard Zinn? Great historian, great American historian. And I think he said something very important here. He said to be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It's based on the fact that human history is a history not of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. It's a very mindful statement. That's why I put it in red there. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending the spinning top of a world in a different direction. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. This is a mindfulness statement. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. Okay? And that's what I want to leave you with, this empowering statement that we don't have to have big plans, that being present in the present moments of our actions and being mindful in those actions is in fact the way in which we create change. So with that, I'll stop. I probably went longer than I should have, but I think we probably have some time for questions. Good. Or discussion. Great. So thank you.